Thank you, Max, for providing me this opportunity to speak at this event. It is really a privilege to be sharing our thoughts and experiences here with this distinguished audience. My name is Sarbajit. I represent the Keansa Solutions. My organization works in the domain of enterprise performance management, where we create solutions for enterprise planning for um, supply chain, sales, and finance functions. So most of the things that we share have come from our experiences with our customers while we try to solve their problems. So very excited to be here once again and be able to share our information with you. So coming to the topic, the broad topic of this particular webinar, it's about risk, and it's mainly about supply chain risks. And it's a well-known fact, right? When we look at supply chains, they are more global, they are more interconnected, and hence they're more susceptible to disruptions, all kinds of disruptions, geopolitical, natural calamities, market upheavals. And these disruptions can cause severe impact. They can cause monetary impact, which is erosion in margin. And it can also create a lot of sustainability impact. That means that there can be situations where the business cannot sustain itself at all. And there are reputational impact as well. So it's a reality which we all have to take into account. So the focus for my session is primarily supply risks. So when we say supply risk, we are talking about material as well as suppliers. Now, when we go out and talk to our customers, the general way or approach that we see to when we look at supply is primarily to optimize cost and lead times. And then, of course, there are other performance parameters. But many of the times we have lesser attention given to the risk factors that are beyond cost, lead time, and operational performance. And in our view, this perspective needs to change. And why not? You have long enduring strategies that are increasingly coming under the scanner. For example, the decision to offshore. Now, we see new terminology emerging, for example, backshoring, friendshoring. They are not, been there for a long time. They are new terminologies. So they actually question the decision of offshoring because of the realities of the current world. So definitely when we look at how supply risks should be looked at, there is an opportunity to re-look at entire supply planning with risks in mind, and that is what our session is about. So why do we call it having a clear lens to supply risks? So it's all about the view. So without a clear understanding of the risk, it's very difficult to have the right design for resilience. It is not possible to have the right design for resilience unless we have a clear understanding. So in this session, we'll touch upon mainly four things. How do we enhance our risk perception? How do we know what the risks are? Then how do we develop a clear view of the risks and their impact, which is primarily assessment? And then how do we have a decision system that helps us to manage these risks? And finally, how do we execute our business with risks in mind? So if you want to think of it as a framework, and let's just call it resiliency framework. So we have the first step is risk identification, which is increasing our awareness of risks that we are exposed to. Then the second one is risk assessment, which is trying to go deeper and understand the nature and impact of these risks. Then step 3 is to have a way to mitigate these risks proactively. And then the fourth one is a response, is to find ways to minimize impact when a risk event really happens, when it becomes a reality. So let's take the first steps. So risk identification, we talked about that, covering material as well as suppliers. So when we look at material risks, there could be mostly about the nature of the materials themselves, their availabilities, their prices, their, the nature of it being hazardous or not. Supplier risk could be primarily their geopolitical or the climatic locations, their compliance, and their financial viability. These are the different types of supplier risk that we would look at. The interesting thing is that there are these risks often will exist at an intersection, which means that you might have a key material which is coming from a sole supplier which is in an unstable geopolitical or climatic zone. That means if you think about it, it is a major risk for that can affect your sustainability, not just cost. So taking one step forward, when you look at risk identification, you look at the different types of risks. Now on the screen, what you see are about 12 different types of risks. And you have the first two are about sourcing, and they're very well known. You have a sole source or single source supplier. Then from material perspective, you could have end of life materials that you're using for your production purposes. Then there could be issues around hazardous substances. There could be issues with compliance, supplier health, market volatility. You could have issues with supply assurance. There are risk events that are happening globally and that can affect anywhere in our supply chain. It could have which many times are even not noticed early enough, and so on, right? So there are different types of risks that we are exposed to, and some of these, as you can see, can affect supplier, and some of these can affect material. Now, this is mostly about identification of risks. Now we can list down the different types of risks that any particular business is exposed to. But for that, we need a little bit of information, really, when we really want to go deeper and look at assessing these, mainly the impacts of it. And then where do we have information about risk? Because it's very important to understand the information also. Now think about, the risks that we are seeing over here, the sole source or single sourcing risk, and then how do we get this information from? Now this information is all available internally. For example, you could actually have if you look at your bill of material and you are linked with material master and supplier master, you could actually be able to link your key materials to different suppliers and their locations, and you will be able to identify very quickly this information and identify any kind of sole or single source suppliers. Versus there could be things which are where the information is only available externally, where you have to go look out and see from and find information from outside. Now there are many different services which are now available on the internet, which are companies which are providing information about the financial viability of the companies, the prices of commodities and raw materials globally or regionally, or information around the global score of a particular country or a geographical geopolitical area. So these informations are available now, right? The problem many times is that you might have these information available from different places, but when you really want to implement them in terms of your in a decision system, which is many times a tool, and it's a IT system, you need to have this information available and codified in the right way. We will see it at a later point of time in this presentation, how important it is to have this information. But at this point of time, what we are thinking is we have to assess this risk for this information. There are information that is necessary to obtain. Some are internal and some are external. Now, just because something is internal, it might be well understood, like a bill of material can be well understood. The master data can be well understood, but they may not be properly linked. So many times what we have seen is there is information, but the risk related information, the risk related attributes are not available in the system. So that's where, when it comes to really using that information to make decisions, there is a shortage, there is a missing link. We'll come to it as we, when we see more examples. So when we have the information, imagine we have certain ways of knowing, the different ways the risk can affect us. Now, is there a tool? Now, when we look at a tool like FMEA, it's a pretty well-known operational tool for understanding the failure modes and their effects in a very systematic, proactive manner, um, and then be able to prioritize these risks and then have a way to address and have a very concrete action plan to handle each type. So how does it work? So imagine that there's a risk event, and then we look at three things. One is the likelihood, which is like a probability of something happening. Then there is a severity, which is the impact of something happening. And then there's a detectability, like is it something which you can easily detect versus you cannot. Now, each of these can be ranked from a score of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest and 1 being the least in terms of risk. Now, if you put scores for each of these risk events for likelihood, severity, and detectability, and if you multiply these three, you get a risk score. So here, for the first row, the risk score is 160. Often in FMEA terminology, it's called risk priority number. So if you sort the whole thing, you actually see your top risks surfacing above. That means these are the ones that you have to really contain. And then there can be an action plan. Now, this is an explorative tool. That means you start off looking at all the different things that can affect you, and then put your numbers, and then you get that risk score. There are other ways which are more diagnostic tools, which is like you look at a metric like, say, OTIF, and then you go and try to do a root cause assessment of whenever there is an exception, wherever there is a problem with that, and then you try to diagnose what caused it, right? So it is walking back on your own data, trying to figure out what did not work out, and from there you kind of unearth the risk factor. So there are two ways. One is, what we are showing over here is more of an explorative way, and there could be more of a diagnostic way. But whichever way you pick, eventually you should have a way to understand the key risks that your business is exposed to. Now, think about applying this technique to suppliers, and then you evaluate your suppliers on these risk parameters, and then you come up with a risk score value. Now, this value may not be very quantitative initially, because it is not very easy to always get all the different um, risk scores in a very numerically precise manner. So it could be difficult. So often if you have a cross-functional team which is looking at a supplier and what they supply to you, you could actually come with a more qualitative risk score value initially, like a high, medium, low. But the more important thing is that you categorize these suppliers based on not only performance but also the risk score. So far what we have seen is we are looking at categorizing or segmenting suppliers based on their PO value, based on their performance, and then you have different classifications on strategic or transactional, or something which is just on need basis, versus you want to also include risk scores. Now, if you are looking at the table below, you will see that you have suppliers, you have a performance score, you could also have costs, and then you could look at a risk score, and then you come up with a segment which classifies these. So the core idea or core takeaway from here is that how do you bring in the risk score information also in segmenting suppliers? And then when you are doing allocations, this factor also is taken into account, not just their performance, because you always can have a high performance supplier but in a increasingly risky proposition. So the third step is about mitigation. Now, mitigation works at two levels. One is the strategic levels, which is actually driving the policies, and the second one is the operational level, which is driving the plans. So both are important. When you look at strategic level, you might be looking at your sole and single source supplier policy. What should you have? Is there a way to de-risk it? You might also want to go deeper into your supplier network and understand, which ones are high risk materials, high risk suppliers, and then evaluate the entire network, not just a single supplier. It's a difficult job to do, but there are companies that have been able to do it. And you could look at, from a material perspective, you could look at alternate type of bill of materials, alternate recipes to reduce dependencies on specific materials, and many other things. But these are basically things that you do at a strategic level. You may not need to do it, very frequently, but as a matter of policy, take a hard look at it, understand the the dynamic, and you take a decision. So that is what you do at a strategic level. On an operational level, you need more freedom, because if there is things happening, then your operational team needs to have uh, the decision authority to be able to contain the risk. So many times, you could have a risk score based supply allocation. So the company can agree that, okay, there's a risk score, and based on the risk score, you can actually determine certain allocations. You could do dynamic stock level calculation based on certain risks data being available. So there are many ways, but the key thing is that your plan is built in such a way that it is resilient. You're not always knee jerked. You are looking at, when you are building a plan, you are actually building it, with certain, you're baking in the resilience in the plan itself. So that's the mitigation. We'll see some examples. And the fourth thing is the response. So response is primarily many times tool supported, because when you want to respond adequately, precisely, and that's where the tools comes into play. So it has three main things. One is the recognition of an event. That how do I know something has happened, right? So that's very important. Many times these are external events, right? So you have to have the way to identify and recognize the event. Then the second part is to understand the impact of the event, and many times simulation helps you to trace the impact of failure. For example, an event has happened at a certain location, and you know that certain supply networks are operating in those locations, and hence it would affect a certain uh, group of suppliers, right? And then that could actually, map to certain material not being available, and then that can affect into certain products or finished goods not being uh, able to deliver, right? So there's a chain that you could kind of link through an event, right? And your tool should be able to support. If your tool is all properly linked, then you will be able to actually see this. Now there is recommendation, which basically the tool again tells you that what could be an alternate way, what could be a different plan. Is it a alternative to the parts that are affected? Can it be an additional inventory coverage that you want to look for, alternative supplies? So all this recommendation can also come from the tool if the tool is also aware of the alternate possibilities, if the mappings are all there. So I'll show you using a case study. So this is about supply risk management using scenario planning. So the background of the company is that there is a food and beverage company in APAC with multi-region sourcing and business operations. Now, the way they were operating is their supplier allocation plans were all done in a spreadsheet before they were finalized, and then they got punched in the ERP. Much of the data was done manually, and when COVID-19 struck, there's a lot of uncertainty in supply commitments, and that created a massive impact on the delivery. So planning teams, when they had to really understand which supply is available and which is not, and then frequently update the allocations or frequently look at alternate sources, they had a very difficult time because the plans were constantly changing. And when the supply plans were affected, it would of course affect the production plans. And then it was very difficult to perform an impact analysis and create alternate delivery plans based on what was happening. And the whole thing was very difficult to manage. The situation was difficult, and then because of the manual way of doing everything and the unstructured and delinked way of having all this information, it was very difficult to really have a proper response. So what was done is, first of all, move everything into a proper system of planning from spreadsheets. So allocation would be done in a planning system. Now, this particular model in the planning system had cross-referenced suppliers, materials, finished goods. So all these things were cross-referenced. So there's a proper linkage. Now, what was happening here is whenever there's an anticipated changes in a supplier commitment, now if the committed supply is not available during certain weeks, the planner could actually go into the system and change and mark those as unavailable. Now, certain supplier commitments, if they're not available, it would mean that it will affect certain raw materials. Now, that material shortages in on those specific weeks were determined by the tool. And then since materials were linked with products, and we could actually see week on week what is the impact on production plan of this material shortage, and the tool was able to determine that because it's all linked, and you could see that this particular supplier being unable to function will have impact on certain materials, and impact on certain materials would have impact on certain products in the production plan in different weeks. Now, the planner was able to play multiple scenarios in terms of allocation or reprioritizing products, and then be able to compare them and discuss them with different departments, procurement, store, production, sales, and then come up with something which everybody could agree to, everybody could put their arms around, and have a more orchestrated response. So I'll show you a couple of screens here. So this is the supply review. Now, what is happening in this screen is that you will see that there are certain grayed out cells. Now, this is what the planner has tagged where the committed supply is not available. Now, if this happens, the system actually shows in all these red boxes in these weeks that for a particular plant, for a particular material, what are the different the weeks where you don't have enough supply. So there is a raw material exception in all these places. Now, this raw material issue can now be linked to a production review where the system is showing that because in a certain week certain raw materials are not available, certain productions plans will not be fulfilled. So there could be ones that are not fulfilled at all, some could be fulfilled, some could be partially fulfilled. So this is all the system, because all this information is linked, the system is able to show you that. And the other thing that the planner can do over here is that the planner can actually go, imagining that there is a constraint on the material availability, they could actually change the product priority for different products across different lines, and then based so that the raw material gets allocated to them, and then you could replay the scenario and look at the status of fulfillment. Now, the important thing that I would like you to take away from here is that it is happening in orchestration of a planner and a system. Now, all the information is interlinked. Now, the planner can do many things. They can actually tag the weeks when material is not available. Now, it can be a scenario, it may be a real situation, or it can be an anticipated situation. But eventually, where the planner can go and is they can actually go and change and tag those weeks where availability is an issue. Now, they also have the capability to reallocate depending on which alternate supply is available. So that is also a part of the scenario, right? If that fixes the problem. If it doesn't, then you can come to the production and you can look at what gets fulfilled versus what doesn't get fulfilled, and you have a way to kind of take care of those, like I mentioned, by alternating priorities. So there is a tool which allows you to respond to issues when to simulate a problem, look at its impact and respond more cohesively. So the outcome was there was a very clear impact analysis of whenever there is a supply issue, this feedback could be taken back and then the plan could be improved. You could actually recategorize suppliers based on their availability scores, and then realistic reallocations can be applied, right? But eventually better preparedness and alignment between sales and operations, that actually helped a lot when the situations were not very good. So the summary is that worldwide there's a lot of supply risk and it's increasing uh, everywhere, and there is a need to widen our risk perception. Then there are frameworks like FMEA or root cause tools to kind of identify the issues, have create a constructive plan around them so that they can be mitigated. And then the existing data, there is an opportunity to enrich those information to contain risk specific attributes from internal and external sources, intelligently building that database so that they can be used by the decision systems to help us respond more accurately and better, and operate even when there are risks. So that's pretty much what I had to share with you. I hope that this session was useful. It gave you certain things to uh, think about and also put to action. If you have any questions, you could post it on the chat. I'll be more than happy to respond. And then I'm also available to respond to you and have a chat in the networking sessions. So thank you once again for your time and attention. Thank you.